Ecclesiastes Chapter 5, we're going to go back to the first verse, because this chapter's a little bit different than the others we have talked about. He says in the very first verse of Ecclesiastes 5, "Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear, rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil." There was a short film or movie made a few years back that really applies to this verse. It shows this family on Sunday morning. There's a mom and dad and the kids. They're all grumpy. They're grouchy. They're being ugly to one another, just rude and angry. But as soon as they walk into the church building, they put on a happy smile and pretend that they are all fine with one another. And that's what Solomon is talking about right here. He says, walk prudently, walk carefully, walk wisely when you go to the house of God. So this is about worship. Of course, at the time this was written, Solomon had built the temple, and people were worshiping in the temple in Jerusalem. So that represented the house of God. That's where they went to worship. Well, he says, when you are ready to worship, he says it is a very, very serious matter. And you need to be very careful about what you say, what you do, what you think, your whole attitude about worship. So this is kind of where this section, at least the first 7, 8, 9 verses, he's kind of giving some practical, I don't know if we want to call it application, I guess that's the right word to say, about worship. And of course for us that really primarily, not exclusively, but primarily talks about us when we go to church. He tells us, guard your steps. I think one translation puts it, guard your steps. Be careful, because you are entering the house of God. And he says you're drawing near to hear. The Hebrew word there, hear, is the Hebrew word that denotes two things: listening carefully and obeying. There's different Hebrew words for hearing. This is the one that means it's not just listening, it's obeying. He says that is critical, and that's what you need to do. So this is his first admonition or exhortation, whatever we might want to call it. He says, when you enter the house of God, be prepared to listen, be prepared to obey. Both. And that's the first thing he tells us. So, you must prepare to worship. You must prepare to worship. And when you go to the house of God, you need to get your ears tuned. You need to clean out your ears, because you need to hear the Word of God. You need to hear it. You need to listen to it. You need to obey it. And that's what's so important about it. It's not, nor should it ever be, just going through the motions. He says you need to understand that when you worship, especially collectively, that you're not there for entertainment. You're not there to make yourself feel good. You are there to worship the Almighty God. And so it's not about, and thankfully there are many churches realizing that when Christians meet, it is not about programs and entertainment and things for the youth or things for the senior citizens, or that's not what it's about. Just look at what the church did in the first century. If you want to know what worship is supposed to be like, look at the first century. Look at the book of Acts. See how they worshiped. That's what we need to focus on, not all this extraneous stuff. And that's what Solomon is saying 1,000 years before the church ever even came into existence. He says worship is something you prepare for, and hypocrisy in worship is one of the worst sins imaginable. You need to go to worship preparing to listen, to hear, obey, and not do it hypocritically or in any other way. That's how serious it is. He says it's draw near rather to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. He says it's foolish to go through the motions of worship, the rituals, if you're not there for the right reason, if you're not there to obey, if you're not there to listen. He says it's foolish. It is foolish. And he says, along with that, because this is all the same thought, do not be rash with your mouth. Still really focusing, this certainly applies across the board, but he's still talking about worship. Do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth, therefore let your words be few. Watch what you say. So not only when you go to worship do you need to be careful how you listen, but be careful what you say. Well, this applies to when we sing. Be careful what you sing. Be careful what you sing. Because what's important when you sing is not whether you hit the right notes or not. It's that, do you believe the words of the song? That's why we should only have songs that, accord with the Bible. But do you believe what those words are saying, and are you ready to obey those words? So the words of the songs are critical. And for us, that's the application from verse 2. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you sing. Because you're doing this, notice the expression, before God. When we sing, we're worshiping God. We're doing this before God, in the presence of God. So it can be real easy to sing a song and not pay any attention to what it's actually saying. He says, be careful about doing that. Be careful about doing that. It's not important that you hit the notes right, but it's important that you mean what you sing. So that's what he's telling us here. So think about what you say when you sing. Because, he says, God is in heaven and you're on earth. He says that's why. God is in heaven. He's the sovereign, He's the ruler, He's the one that is in charge of the entire universe. You, on the other hand, are on earth. We're not God. It seems like since the 70s especially, so many churches have been concerned about making people feel good when they worship, or meeting their needs and so forth. That is not what it's about, Solomon says. It's not what it's about at all. It's about God. It's about worshiping God, showing our love for God, our adoration for God. Why? Because of who He is. He's in heaven and you're not. So when He's told us how He wants to be worshipped, that's the final say. It's not about what might make me feel better. I should feel better because I'm doing what God told me to do. That's why I should feel better. I should feel good, whether there's 10 people in worship or 10,000, I should feel good because I am worshiping God how He has instructed. Because again, He's in heaven and we're not. He's the sovereign ruler, we're not. He's the one that's given us an eternal spirit, we haven't. He's the one that created this world, we didn't. So He's the one that deserves worship. Would someone read Isaiah 55, 8 and 9? You'll recognize these verses, but they really go right along with what we're talking about. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9.
For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts.
And that's what Solomon is saying. We can't think God's thoughts. They're so much higher than ours. And people want to change how God wants to be worshipped. When you're doing that, you're being presumptuous. You're saying, I know better than God does how we should worship Him. God has told us specifically how He wants to be worshipped. And when we change that in any way, what we're actually telling God is, well, we know better than you do. We know better than you do, so we'll worship this way because it's better. Now think about how presumptuous that sounds. I know more than you do, God. Because that's what we're saying when we change worship. His thoughts are not our thoughts. He says, let your words be few, for a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. The more words, the more talking someone does, the more likely it is he's going to say something foolish. The more likely it is he's going to say something foolish, Solomon says. A greater chance. And that's certainly true when we worship, but it's also true, all these other times. So he says, be economical with your words. Be economical with your words. Foolishness, he says, leads to much talking. And I know we've all heard people talk for a long time, and then when they were done, what in the world did that person say? Did he say anything worthwhile whatsoever? He might have talked for 15 minutes, but did he say anything worthwhile? Be careful, he says. Be careful about it. So, this whole idea of worship revolves around, being sincere, being prepared when you worship. When we sing, make sure we sing the words because we mean it. Trust and obey. If we sing that song, let's make sure we mean those words. Trust and obey. Make sure we mean it. Our words are important, he says. Be careful about them. And of course that goes right into when he says, when you make a vow to God, this is what we had talked about last time, do not delay to pay it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. And we talked about how we need to be very careful about what we say. In other words, if we say we're going to be at such and such a place at such and such a time, then we need to do all in our power to be there or to do it. Sometimes, of course, it's not possible. Things happen. But still talking about the importance of our words. That's why he says, if you're not sure you can keep the vow, don't make it. If you're not sure you can't keep the promise, don't make it. Only do it if you're certain that you can fulfill it. That's how important it is. Words, words, words are so important to us, important to God as well. Do what you say. Would someone read Psalm 76:11? This talks about vows, promises. Psalm 76, verse 11.
Make vows to the Lord your God and pay them. Let all who are around him bring presents to him who ought to be feared.
All right. Make your vows to God. And if you do, he says pay them. Pay them. It's real easy to make a promise. It's a lot harder to keep it, he says. Whether that's to God or to someone else. He says be very careful about what you say. Remember Jesus talked about two sons. One that said he would do it and then didn't. And then one that said he wasn't going to, but changed his mind and did it. Well, that's what Solomon's kind of saying here. You know, if you're going to make some sort of vow or promise, then do it. Otherwise, don't even say it. Don't even go there. Might say, don't play games with God. Remember the old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, that's what Solomon's kind of saying here. A lot of people make a lot of promises and say they're going to do this and say they're going to do that. And you probably talk with people who said, yes, I'm going to be there at church on Sunday and I'm going to do this and that. Never happens. Never happens. So that's what Solomon is warning about. He says, be careful about that. He says, don't let your mouth cause your flesh to sin. Nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Don't make excuses, I guess we might say is what he's saying. Don't make excuses. There's lots of ways our mouth can lead us into sin. So he says, don't let your mouth cause you to sin. You know, James talks a lot about that in James chapter 3. A lot of that chapter is about your mouth, your words, you know, how it just takes a little bit to cause a big problem. He says, so don't let your mouth do that. Or say to the messenger that it was an error. Well, that's not what I meant. That's what everybody understood me to say, but that's not what I meant. And people will do that, and people still do that, and people have been doing that for centuries. Well, you just misunderstood me. And sometimes that happens. So make sure when you say something that it's clear enough for people to understand it. Make sure it is clear. If you're making a commitment, a promise, a vow, make it clear. And then if you don't keep it, don't make excuses by saying, well, you just misunderstood what I actually meant. That's not what I said at all. Solomon says, don't go there. He says, in the multitude of dreams and many words, there's also vanity. So he says, this is what you need to do, but fear God. Fear God. I remember talking to a Christian lady years ago. Oh, she hated the idea about fearing God. She didn't think any preacher or any teacher should ever bring up the idea of fearing God. She thought it was unbiblical. But yet, pretty much from Genesis to Revelation, Old Testament and New, talks about fearing God. And of course there's a lot of ways that we fear God, but one way is that we recognize His power and His might, and that He's in heaven and we're on earth. He's the sovereign God. We're not sovereign. You know, we're not like God in that sense. So we should be in awe of Him. We should revere Him and respect Him. and also understand that He has made an eternal hell. That's part of fearing God, is understanding that He has the power. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew, don't fear the one that's able to kill the body, fear the one that's able to destroy both body and soul in hell. He says that's the one you need to be afraid of. So even Jesus said, recognize the fact that God has that power. So Solomon ends up by saying, but fear God. Fear God. That's what you need to do. And of course that's how he ends Ecclesiastes in Ecclesiastes 12:13. So he's going to bring that up again, about the importance of that. All right, comments before we go on? He's going to start talking about vanity and reverence and money. Or we can just skip the part about money if you want. We can just skip that part. Okay, he says, if you see... Now, this is at least the second time he's brought up the idea of oppression and justice. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. He says, don't be surprised if there's not justice. See, Solomon is being practical here. He says it doesn't make any difference what king you have in this world. There's always going to be injustice, and there's always going to be oppression. It's always going to be. Now that doesn't mean we should not try and do what we can, but Solomon is saying that's the way. He says don't marvel at it. There's always going to be people who are oppressed. There's always going to be people who are not treated fairly. They're treated unjustly. He says it's always going to be with us until the end of time. And then God's going to right every wrong. But until then, there is going to be injustice. He says that's the way it is. It's not going to change. It is not going to change. High official watches over high official. He may just be talking about bureaucracy here. There's always bureaucracies. Just about every empire has bureaucracies. There's one official that's over another official, over another official. And there's always going to be, because those people make mistakes. They do things they shouldn't do. So there's always going to be those injustices. It says don't marvel over that. And even the king is served from the field. I guess there's a couple of ways to look at that, but even the king sometimes is involved in that. Even the king. He says we need to be aware that that's always going to happen. And don't be surprised about it. Don't be surprised at all when you hear about injustice. I'm just one of those people that just hate to hear about injustice. But Solomon says it's a part of life and it's not going away. Doesn't make any difference where you go. There's going to be injustice. There's going to be oppression. There's going to be wrongs committed. He says that is never ever going to change. He says that's the way it is. At every level. I mean, from local to international. There's going to be injustices. People abuse their power. I mean, it might be a person in a courthouse in a local community. It might be a governor. It might be a president. It might be a king. It might be a judge. People abuse their power. They always have, Solomon says, and they always will. They always will. Don't be surprised, because it's going to happen. So, injustice is here to stay. And it can take all kinds of It can come in all kinds of ways. But often, as he mentions, it's the poorer people who receive the worst part of it. That's why God's always been so concerned about the poor. When you go back to the law of Moses, he was concerned about the poor. And then he wanted people to help, because that happened to them a lot. So regardless of how good the government is, it's never going to be good. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be totally just or fair. There never has been one, and there never will be one. That's what he tells us. He says, so don't expect it. Don't expect it at all. All right. And then for the last few minutes, it says, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? Prosperity, money, wealth, riches, goods, whatever we might want to call them. It said that, John D. Rockefeller, when he was asked about how much money was enough, his answer was just a little bit more. And of course he was worth vast amounts. But that's what Solomon is saying. People will never be satisfied. If you love silver, then it doesn't make any difference if you have a whole room of silver. You'll want a little more silver. In other words, the key is if you love silver. It says it's not wrong to have the room of silver, but if you love it, you'll never be content with it. You'll always want a little bit more. The only way to curb that is to be content. Is to be content. If you have a room of silver, be satisfied. If all you have is a bag of silver, be satisfied with the bag of silver. If you love abundance, he says the same thing. You'll never be satisfied. If you love it. Nothing wrong with having an abundance, but if you love it, you'll always want more. And when goods increase, they increase who eat them. If I was to win the lottery, I don't play the lottery, but if I won the lottery, I'm sure within a day or two there would be so many people at my door wanting something. That's what Solomon is saying here, right here. That's what he's saying. When you have more, there's going to be more people who want them from you. So what does that do? Causes stress, causes trouble, causes anxiety, whatever you want to call it. There's always going to be people who want to consume what you have. So that's why he said, be careful about loving wealth and goods and riches and prosperity. Don't think that that's going to solve all your problems. Because that's going to increase some of your problems, because you're going to have all of these unknown relatives showing up wanting something. It says, so it's not going to be a cure-all. So he says, what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? People who have a lot sometimes don't sleep very well because they're worried about them. If your money's in stocks and bonds, then you're worried about what the market's going to do. Or if you have gold and silver, you're wondering about the price of gold. I remember it was just, there's a place near Walmart, that shows the gold price. And Denise and I commented on it, go, like we have gold or silver. We have none. But, we always look at the price of the gold. And it wasn't just a couple of years ago that is up around $1,800, well, now it's only like $1,200. Well, that's losing $600 an ounce. Doesn't mean anything to me because I don't have an ounce. But if I had a bunch of gold, see how much anxiety that could cause? Well, that's what Solomon's saying. It can cause anxiety. It can cause anxiety if you have a lot. And he says, and we'll finish with verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. You know, as a general rule, people who work hard all day can sleep better because they've done something worthwhile, and so they can sleep. Not so with the rich. A lot of the rich, especially if they love it, and that's what he's talking about in these verses, loving it, then a lot of them can't sleep. You know, they're worried about what's going to happen, or is the price of this going up or down, or what if someone steals something, or, you know, on and on and on. So there are problems, he says. If, and that's the key part, if you love it, if that's what you love it, and that's what you live for. He says, ask yourself whether it's worth it. Well, our time is up. It's 20 till. So, Lord willing, we'll start there about verse 13 next week.